the 21st of February 1945, Los Baños internment camp, Laguna Province, Philippines. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barbed wire fences of Los Baños internment camp, 40 miles southeast of Manila. Inside the compound, 2,147 Allied civilians, men, women, and children, moved through their morning routine with the mechanical slowness of the starving. Their bodies, once healthy and vibrant, had been reduced to walking skeletons by 3 years of captivity under the Japanese Empire. Sister Eleanor Francis Andrews, one of 47 Maryknoll sisters imprisoned in the camp, recorded in her diary that morning with a shaking hand. "Apparently 0 hour has approached. No more food in the camp. Tonight is our last meal, unless something happens." The Japanese had told the camp's executive committee that there was starvation everywhere in the Philippines, in America, even in the US Army itself. But the prisoners could see through the barbed wire that their Japanese guards remained well fed, their uniforms still fitting properly while the internees' clothes hung loose on emaciated frames. The transformation of Los Baños from an agricultural college campus into a hell on earth had been gradual but relentless. When the camp first opened in May 1943, built to relieve overcrowding at Santo Tomas in Manila, some internees had even described it as a delightful spot. The grounds of the former University of the Philippines College of Agriculture seemed almost peaceful compared to the chaos they'd left behind. But that illusion shattered quickly under the command structure the Japanese established. At the top of this hierarchy of cruelty stood Warrant Officer Sadaki Konishi, the camp's second-in-command, who had proclaimed himself the strongest white race hater in the army. His promise to the internees had been simple and terrifying. "Before I'm done, you'll be eating dirt." By February 1945, he had nearly succeeded. Daily rations had been reduced to fewer than 450 calories, mostly a watery rice porridge called lujao that provided almost no nutritional value. The human body requires approximately 1,200 calories per day just to maintain basic functions while at rest. The internees were receiving less than half that amount. Marie Adams, a Red Cross worker who had been imprisoned since May 1942, would later calculate that at the rate of starvation in February 1945, she had perhaps 4 to 5 days left to live. She weighed 95 pounds at liberation, down from her normal weight of 130. The symptoms of advanced starvation had become universal throughout the camp. Irritability that made prisoners argue over nothing, aches that extended to the tips of fingers and toes, and a lethargy so profound that some internees would sit on their beds staring at a sink across the room, wondering if it was worth the effort to stand up and walk to it. Children, who should have been playing and learning, instead lay listless in the barracks. Babies cried weakly for milk their mothers could no longer produce. The camp hospital, overwhelmed and undersupplied, could do nothing for the victims of beriberi, malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis that ravaged the population. Every day, 1 or 2 more prisoners died, their bodies carried to hastily dug graves while fellow internees wondered who would be next. The Japanese guards, perhaps sensing the war's tide had turned against them, had grown increasingly brutal. Anyone caught trying to escape, even those who ventured outside to forage for food to feed starving children, was shot on sight. In early February, a new horror emerged. Japanese soldiers began digging long trenches near the prisoners' barracks. The internees didn't need to be told what these were for. They had heard whispers of massacres at other camps, of Japanese commanders who chose to execute their prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. The trenches could only mean one thing: mass graves for a planned slaughter. It was against this backdrop of desperation that the camp's executive committee made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. On February 12, they authorized 3 young men, Peter Miles, Freddie Zervalakos, and Benjamin Edwards, to attempt an escape. Previously, escapes had been forbidden because they triggered violent reprisals against those left behind. But with death approaching for everyone in the camp, the committee decided the risk was worth taking. These 3 would try to reach American forces and plead for immediate rescue. Under cover of darkness, the 3 men crawled beneath the double line of barbed wire fences, their hearts pounding as they passed within feet of guard posts. They disappeared into the jungle, where they soon encountered Filipino guerrillas, who agreed to guide them to American lines. The journey that followed was its own ordeal, several days through crocodile-infested waters and dense jungle, traveling mostly at night to avoid Japanese patrols. But they carried with them information that would prove invaluable: detailed layouts of the camp, guard schedules, and the desperate state of the internees. General Douglas MacArthur stood before a map of Luzon, his face grim as he received reports from recently liberated prison camps. At Santo Tomas University in Manila, American forces had found 4,000 civilian internees on the brink of starvation. At Cabanatuan, where Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas had staged a daring raid on January 30, they had rescued 522 military prisoners who told horrifying stories of Japanese brutality. The pattern was clear and terrifying. As American forces advanced, the Japanese were increasingly likely to massacre their prisoners rather than allow them to be freed. Los Baños remained the last major internment camp on Luzon still in Japanese hands. Located 40 miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 Japanese troops, it presented a seemingly impossible challenge. MacArthur turned to Major General Joseph M. Swing, commander of the 11th Airborne Division, with a simple but daunting order: get those people out. The 11th Airborne Division, known as the Angels, had already proven themselves in brutal combat across the Philippines. They had jumped onto Tagaytay Ridge on February 3, fought through the fortified Genco line south of Manila, and were currently engaged in vicious battles for Nichols Field and Fort William McKinley. Swing's first instinct was to request a postponement. His men were exhausted, bloodied, with some companies down to 30% strength. But MacArthur's response was unequivocal. Those civilians didn't have time to wait. On February 4, even as his division continued fighting in southern Manila, Swing called together his staff to begin planning the impossible. His G2 intelligence officer, Colonel Henry Mueller, had been gathering information about Los Baños for weeks. His G3 operations officer, Colonel Douglas Quant, would need to create a plan that could penetrate 40 miles behind enemy lines, neutralize a well-defended camp, and evacuate over 2,000 weak and sick civilians, all before thousands of nearby Japanese troops could respond. The planning intensified dramatically when Peter Miles and his fellow escapees reached American lines on February 15. Sitting in a tent at 11th Airborne Headquarters, exhausted but determined, they sketched the camp layout on paper, marking guard posts, describing the internees' physical condition, and providing a crucial piece of intelligence. The Japanese guards performed morning calisthenics at 7 a.m., exercising in their loincloths without weapons. This half-hour window of vulnerability would become the cornerstone of the rescue plan. Major Henry Burgess, commander of the 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was selected to lead the primary assault force. At 31 years old, Burgess was a veteran of numerous combat jumps and amphibious operations. When briefed on the mission, he couldn't hide his concerns. How could my force of 412 paratroopers slip undetected deep into Japanese-controlled territory, wipe out a large number of enemy guards at the camp before they could kill the inmates, and bring back to safety 2,200 weak men, women, and children, many of whom were unable to walk? The solution would require unprecedented coordination between multiple forces. Colonel Quant and his team developed a 4-phase plan that would have to unfold with clockwork precision. Phase 1 involved Lieutenant George Scow's reconnaissance platoon and Filipino guerrillas infiltrating the area 2 days before the main assault. These 31 men would cross Laguna de Bay in small bankers under cover of darkness, make contact with local guerrilla forces, and position themselves around the camp. Their job? Eliminate sentries at the critical moment and mark the drop zone for the paratroopers. Phase 2 centered on Lieutenant John Ringler's Company B of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. 130 paratroopers would jump at dangerously low altitude directly onto the camp at 7 a.m., catching the guards during their morning exercise. They would have to neutralize all resistance and secure the internees within minutes. Phase 3 would see Major Burgess leading the remainder of 1st Battalion across Laguna de Bay in 54 amphibious tractors. These LVT-4 Amtraks from the 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion would carry the force to a beach near the camp, then serve as evacuation vehicles for the internees. The swimming tanks would be the only way to evacuate so many weakened civilians quickly. Phase 4 required Lieutenant Colonel Robert Soul's 188th Glider Infantry Regiment to launch a diversionary attack down Highway 1, engaging the Japanese 8th Tiger Division to prevent them from reinforcing the camp. This force would have to convince thousands of Japanese troops that they faced a major offensive, not a rescue operation. The margin for error was 0. If any element failed, the mission would collapse, and the internees would certainly be massacred. Weather could scatter the paratroopers. The Amtraks could be spotted crossing the lake. The diversionary force might not hold the Japanese reserves. A single alert sentry could trigger an alarm that would doom everyone. On February 18, Burgess pulled his exhausted battalion off the Genko line, where they had been engaged in brutal combat. Company H had been reduced from 121 men to just 49. Company B, chosen to make the jump, was down to about 80 men. Burgess would augment them with a light machine gun platoon under Lieutenant Walter Hettlinger to bring the force up to about 130 paratroopers. These men, already pushed to their limits, would have to find the strength for one more mission. February 21 to 2/2/1945, Laguna de Bay. Lieutenant George Scow checked his watch in the darkness. 2 a.m., February 21. Around him, 30 members of the 11th Airborne's Provisional Reconnaissance Platoon silently loaded into 3 bankers, the native fishing boats that would carry them across Laguna de Bay. With them were elements of the Filipino guerrilla forces, men who knew every trail and hiding spot in the jungle around Los Baños. The moon was new, providing perfect darkness for their infiltration. The crossing was treacherous. Japanese patrol boats regularly swept the lake, and discovery would mean certain death. The men paddled in absolute silence, every splash of water seeming impossibly loud in the darkness. Several times they froze, holding their breath as engine sounds approached, then faded into the distance. After what seemed like an eternity, the boats scraped onto the shore near the barrio of Nanhaya. Waiting for them was an entire network of Filipino guerrillas who had been preparing for this moment. The Hunters ROTC guerrillas, formed originally from cadets of the Philippine Military Academy, had been operating around Los Baños for months. Led by Colonel Frank Quesada and including teenage fighters like future film star Mario Montenegro, these guerrillas had provided invaluable intelligence about the camp. They knew guard rotations, weapon positions, and most importantly, they had been in contact with Filipino workers who entered the camp daily. At a small schoolhouse that served as their temporary headquarters, Scow met with guerrilla leaders and, incredibly, with more escapees from the camp, including Freddy Zervulacos and Benjamin Edwards, who had risked their lives to return and help with the rescue. On the schoolhouse blackboard, they sketched updated layouts of the camp, marking new guard positions and confirming the morning routine that would be their window of opportunity. Scow divided his forces into 6 teams, each with a specific sector of the camp perimeter to neutralize. Team 1 would take out the guards at the main gate. Team 2 would eliminate the sentries along the north fence. Each team included Filipino guerrillas who knew the terrain intimately and could move through the jungle vegetation like ghosts. They spent February 22 hidden in the jungle around the camp, observing, waiting, counting guards, memorizing every detail. The guerrillas faced a terrible dilemma. They believed they could potentially take the camp themselves, but they had no way to evacuate the internees. Without trucks or boats, the prisoners would have to walk 40 miles to American lines, an impossibility for people who could barely stand. Moreover, they knew Japanese retaliation against local civilians would be swift and brutal. Villages had been burned and populations massacred for far less than attacking a prison camp. The guerrillas made a pact. They would wait for the Americans, but if they saw the Japanese beginning to execute prisoners, they would attack immediately regardless of consequences. On the night of February 22, as Scow's men lay hidden in the darkness around the camp, the rest of the operation was moving into position. At Nichols Field, Lieutenant John Ringler gathered his Company B paratroopers for a final briefing. Most of these men had already made combat jumps, but this would be different. They would jump at only 400 to 500 feet, barely enough time for their parachutes to fully deploy. The drop zone was tiny, bordered by power lines that would electrocute anyone who hit them. There would be no time for assembly after landing. They would have to fight immediately. "If you hit those power lines, you're fried," Ringler told his men bluntly. There was no sugarcoating the danger. But he also told them about the internees, the women and children, the elderly and sick, the Americans who had been waiting 3 years for rescue. Every paratrooper in that briefing knew the stakes. Meanwhile, at Mamatid on the shore of Laguna de Bay, Major Burgess supervised the loading of 54 Amtraks with his remaining battalion forces. Each amphibious tractor could carry about 25 people, and they would need every inch of space to evacuate the internees. Engineers from the 127th Airborne Engineer Battalion prepared demolition charges. Medics loaded extra supplies, knowing they would encounter severe malnutrition and disease. Two 75mm pack howitzers from the 457th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion were carefully secured to provide covering fire. The Amtrak crews of the 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Gibbs, had their own concerns. The 7-mile crossing of Laguna de Bay would take about an hour, all of it in broad daylight. If Japanese observers spotted them, if patrol boats intercepted them, if shore batteries opened fire, the slow-moving tractors would be sitting ducks. They would have to trust that the diversionary attack would draw Japanese attention elsewhere. Part 4. Angels from Heaven. The 23rd of February 1945, 6:45 a.m., Los Baños internment camp. The morning of February 23 began like any other in Los Baños. Internees rose slowly, their movements sluggish from starvation. Parents tried to quiet crying children who had no energy to play. The sick lay in their bunks, too weak to rise. Outside, Japanese guards moved to their positions, preparing for the 7 a.m. roll call that started each day. 12-year-old Robert Wheeler stepped out of his barracks with his family, preparing to line up for morning count. The boy, like all the children in the camp, had learned to move slowly, to conserve what little energy remained in his malnourished body. He glanced up at the sky, a habit born from 3 years of watching for American planes that never came. But this morning was different. At 6:55 a.m., Lieutenant Ringler stood in the open door of the lead C-47 transport, the wind tearing at his equipment. Below, he could see the camp clearly, the barbed wire, the guard towers, the neat rows of barracks. Most importantly, he could see the white smoke grenade thrown by Scow's reconnaissance team, marking the tiny drop zone. Ringler turned to the men packed into the aircraft behind him and shouted over the engine noise, "Stand up! Hook up!" In the camp, Warrant Officer Konishi had just stepped outside, preparing to oversee the morning calisthenics. Guards across the compound were stripping to their loincloths, stacking their rifles in neat rows as they did every morning. It was a routine so ingrained that none of them noticed the faint drone of aircraft engines approaching from the north. At exactly 7 a.m., Ringler shouted, "Go!" and threw himself out the door at 400 feet. Behind him, 130 paratroopers of Company B and the machine gun platoon followed in rapid succession from 9C-47 seconds, flying in 3 perfect V formations. To the internees watching from below, it seemed as if the sky had suddenly bloomed with white parachutes, angels descending from heaven. Young Robert Wheeler would never forget that moment. Suddenly, the sky filled with the angels, the men of Company B, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, floating down as if from heaven in their white parachutes. Inside the camp, internees began screaming, crying, shouting, "They've come! They've come!" The Japanese guards, caught completely off guard, scrambled for their weapons. But Scow's reconnaissance teams were already in action. Guerrillas burst from the jungle, machetes flashing as they fell upon the confused sentries. A Japanese guard at the main gate had just enough time to reach for his rifle before a Filipino guerrilla's bolo knife ended his life. Within seconds, the carefully planned violence erupted across the camp perimeter. The paratroopers landed hard on the packed earth, several suffering injuries from the low-altitude drop. Corporal Francis Flanagan hit the railroad tracks and was knocked unconscious, spraining his ankle severely. But the rest were up and moving within seconds, shedding their parachutes and racing toward their objectives. The months of training, the muscle memory of countless drills, took over. Lieutenant Ringler's first platoon charged straight through the main gate, firing as they ran. Japanese guards, many still in their underwear, tried desperately to resist but were cut down within moments. The second platoon swept along the eastern fence line, eliminating guard posts with grenades and automatic weapons fire. Hetlinger's machine gunners set up covering positions, their weapons chattering as they suppressed any attempted resistance. Inside the barracks, internees threw themselves to the floor as bullets whined overhead. Parents covered their children with their own bodies. The Marinol sisters huddled together, praying as the sound of combat raged outside. Then, miraculously, American voices. "Stay down. We're here to get you out." At 7:15 a.m., just as the paratroopers were securing the camp, Major Burgess's Amtracs roared up from the beach. The amphibious tractors smashed through the camp's front gate, machine guns blazing. Burgess himself was in the lead vehicle, standing exposed in the commander's position, directing the assault. A Japanese pillbox opened fire, and the Amtracs immediately responded. There, 50-caliber machine guns turning the fortification into splinters. The sight of the massive armored vehicles crashing through the gates sent the remaining Japanese defenders fleeing into the jungle. Those who ran were pursued by Filipino guerrillas, who showed no mercy. The Hunters ROTC fighters, some as young as 16, chased Japanese soldiers through the undergrowth, cutting them down with bolos, rifles, and pistols. Not a single Japanese guard from the camp garrison survived the morning. With the camp secured, a new crisis emerged. The internees, suddenly free after years of captivity, milled about in confusion. Some were crying hysterically. Others stood frozen in shock. Children clung to their parents. The elderly and sick couldn't walk. And somewhere out there, thousands of Japanese troops were certainly preparing to counterattack. Major Burgess knew they had perhaps 2 hours before the Japanese could organize a response. The internees had to be loaded and evacuated immediately. But many prisoners, traumatized and disoriented, refused to leave their meager possessions behind. Some wouldn't abandon the small gardens they had cultivated to supplement their starvation rations. Others insisted on searching for missing friends or family members. Lieutenant Hetlinger came up with a brutal but effective solution. He ordered his men to start burning the barracks. As flames consumed the nipa huts, internees finally understood they had to leave. Paratroopers began carrying those who couldn't walk. Sergeant John Fulton emerged from a barracks with a baby in his helmet, 3-day-old Lois Kathleen McCoy, born in captivity, now being carried to freedom in an American soldier's steel helmet. The Amtracs backed up to the barracks, and paratroopers began the delicate process of loading the internees. Women and children first, then the elderly and sick. The vehicles, designed to carry troops and equipment, were soon packed with emaciated civilians. Paratroopers lifted skeletal figures with shocking gentleness, many of them fighting back tears at the condition of their fellow Americans. Sister Miriam Louise Kroger, one of the Marinol sisters, would later write, "Our appreciation of the boys' heroism and utter selflessness is boundless." She watched as young paratroopers, some barely out of their teens, carefully lifted nuns and children into the vehicles, their faces grim with determination. Meanwhile, 11 miles away, Lieutenant Colonel Soule's diversionary force was raising hell. The 188th Glider Infantry Regiment, supported by tank destroyers and artillery, had launched a fierce attack across the San Juan River at dawn. The Japanese 8th Division, convinced they faced a major offensive, committed their reserves to stopping what appeared to be a breakthrough attempt toward Los Baños. The artillery duel was fierce. The 472nd and 675th Field Artillery Battalions pounded Japanese positions, while enemy guns responded in kind. The diversionary force had to make enough noise, cause enough destruction, to keep thousands of Japanese soldiers focused on them instead of the real objective. Men died in that diversionary attack, knowing their sacrifice was buying time for the rescue. Back at the camp, the loading continued with desperate efficiency. Paratroopers formed human chains, passing children from hand to hand into the Amtracs. One soldier was seen carrying 2 small Filipino children, one under each arm, while a third child clung to his back. The camp's hospital was emptied, with paralyzed and unconscious patients carried on improvised stretchers. By 8:30 a.m., the last internees were loaded. The Amtracs, now dangerously overloaded, began the journey back to the beach. Those who could walk formed a column alongside the vehicles, with paratroopers flanking them for protection. Filipino civilians from nearby barrios lined the road, pressing bananas and coconuts into the hands of the liberated prisoners, tears streaming down their faces. At the beach, a brief firefight erupted as Japanese forces attempted to interdict the evacuation. The two pack howitzers that had been brought ashore immediately went into action, their crews working with practiced efficiency to suppress enemy positions. An Amtrak took machine gun fire from a hillside position, water spouting through holes in its hull. The crew chief pulled his .45 pistol and pointed it at the artillery crew, shouting that anyone who fired the howitzer again from the moving vehicle would get a bullet in the head. The recoil might sink them. The 23rd of February 1945, 11 a.m., American lines. The first Amtraks reached Mamatid at approximately 10 a.m., their human cargo spilling onto safe ground for the first time in over 3 years. Army medics rushed forward with stretchers and medical supplies, immediately triaging the most serious cases. Field kitchens had been set up, and the aroma of real food, beef stew, fresh bread, coffee drifted across the beach. The liberated internees reacted in different ways. Some collapsed on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Others stood silent, unable to process their sudden freedom. Children, many of whom had no memory of life outside barbed wire, clung fearfully to their parents. The Marinol sisters knelt in prayer, giving thanks for their deliverance. Medical officers were shocked by what they saw. The average male internee had lost 53 pounds during captivity. Women and children showed clear signs of severe malnutrition, distended bellies, skin lesions, hair loss. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, had left many with swollen legs and failing hearts. Doctors immediately began administering vitamins, and carefully controlled portions of food too much too fast could kill someone in such an advanced state of starvation. The paratroopers of Company B were the last to leave Los Baños. They conducted a final sweep of the camp, ensuring no internee had been left behind. Then they set fire to everything: guard towers, administrative buildings, even the trenches that had been dug for mass graves. As they marched out, the camp that had been a symbol of suffering for 2,147 people was consumed by flames. Major Burgess, bringing up the rear of the column, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mission had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest hopes. Of the 2,147 internees, every single one had been rescued. Not one prisoner had been killed or seriously wounded during the operation. American casualties were minimal. Various accounts differ, but most agree that only 2 to 4 American soldiers died, with a handful wounded. The Filipino guerrillas had suffered 2 casualties. But the story didn't end with the rescue. Warrant Officer Konishi, the sadistic camp administrator, had escaped into the jungle during the initial assault. Making his way to Japanese lines, he gathered a force and returned to Los Baños that afternoon, expecting to find the camp still under American control. Instead, he found smoking ruins and no sign of the prisoners he had tormented for so long. Enraged by the escape of his victims and the destruction of the camp, Konishi turned his fury on the innocent Filipino civilians of Los Baños town. What followed was a massacre that would haunt the region for generations. Japanese troops, joined by Filipino collaborators known as Makapili, systematically murdered approximately 1,500 civilians. Men, women, and children were bayoneted, shot, and burned alive in their homes. The town's priest was crucified. Entire families were wiped out. The massacre continued for days, a final act of barbarity by an army facing defeat. The Filipino civilians had paid the ultimate price for their role in supporting the guerrillas and helping the Americans. Their sacrifice would be remembered alongside the heroism of the rescue itself. Epilogue: the textbook operation. The Los Baños Raid entered military history as perhaps the most perfectly executed rescue operation of World War II. Every element had worked exactly as planned: the infiltration, the parachute assault, the amphibious movement, the diversionary attack. The timing had been precise to the minute. The coordination between American airborne troops and Filipino guerrillas had been flawless. 50 years later, General Colin Powell, speaking at a reunion of the 11th Airborne Division, would declare, "I doubt that any airborne unit in the world will ever be able to rival the Los Baños prison raid. It is the textbook operation for all ages and all armies." The rescue represented something more than military excellence. It demonstrated the American military's commitment to leaving no one behind, to risking everything to save innocent lives. The young paratroopers who jumped at dangerously low altitude, the Amtrak crews who crossed open water under enemy observation, the Filipino guerrillas who risked Japanese retaliation, all had participated in something extraordinary. For the internees, liberation brought its own challenges. Many struggled with what would later be called survivor's guilt, especially when they learned of the massacre of Filipino civilians. Some families had been torn apart by the experience, unable to return to their pre-war lives. Children who had spent formative years in captivity carried psychological scars that would never fully heal. Physical recovery took months or years, some never fully regained their health. But they had survived. Howard Hart, liberated from Los Baños as a 7-year-old boy, remembered a paratrooper picking him up during the raid and saying over and over, "I'm going to take you home, kid. I'm going to take you home." That promise, made in the midst of gunfire and chaos, represented everything the rescue meant, not just military victory, but human compassion triumphing over cruelty. The Los Baños Liberation Memorial Scholarship Foundation was established by survivors to honor their rescuers and the Filipino civilians who died in the aftermath. Each year, on February 23, at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, students present performances and exhibitions commemorating the raid. The story is retold, ensuring that future generations remember both the darkness of war and the light of liberation. The raid also demonstrated the crucial importance of intelligence and planning in special operations. The information provided by escapees and Filipino guerrillas had been invaluable. The meticulous planning by the 11th Airborne Staff had anticipated every contingency. The split-second timing that caught the Japanese guards at their most vulnerable moment had made the difference between success and catastrophe. Yet despite its perfection, despite its success, the Los Baños raid remained relatively unknown to the American public. On the same day as the rescue, the 23rd of February 1945 photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the iconic image of Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi. That photograph would become one of the most famous images of World War II, overshadowing the news from the Philippines. The men who participated in the raid didn't seem to mind the lack of recognition. They had done their duty, saved innocent lives, and demonstrated the best of American military capability. The paratroopers returned to combat. The war wasn't over, and there were more battles to fight. The Filipino guerrillas melted back into the jungle, continuing their struggle against the Japanese occupation. The Amtrak crews prepared for the next amphibious operation, but for 2,147 people, the 23rd of February 1945 would forever be remembered as the day the angels fell from heaven. The day when young American soldiers and brave Filipino fighters risked everything to snatch them from the jaws of death. The day when the promise made by General MacArthur, "I shall return," was finally, gloriously, kept. The Los Baños raid stands as a testament to meticulous planning, inter-service cooperation, and raw courage. It proved that even in the darkest days of war, when brutality and starvation seemed to have won, heroes could still descend from the sky to save the innocent. It showed that sometimes, against all odds and logic, good can triumph over evil in one perfect moment of military precision and human compassion. As Major Henry Burgess reflected years later, standing on the ground where the camp once stood, the small drop zone between the power lines and railroad tracks seemed impossibly tiny. "You've got to realize how good the 511th was to be able to put those men in such a tight area," he wrote. "They were good. They were brave. And on one Friday morning in February 1945, they were perfect."